He stood by the kitchen window, golden light washing over his bare shoulders through the thin white tank top, and when he turned to set his cup in the sink, I felt his gaze linger briefly before he turned away, unreadable but deliberate. I looked away first, adjusting the belt of my robe without thinking, the silk brushing cold against my spine even though the house was heavy with summer heat. He passed behind me silently, deliberately keeping space, and his nearness sharpening my awareness, in a way I didn't expect. I heard my own breath shift, that subtle change you notice when someone's standing too close in a way they're not supposed to be. My marriage to David had dulled to something closer to an agreement than a connection, two people existing in parallel, efficient in our silence, competent in our shared routines, but untouched by affection. He worked late, ate alone in his office, went to bed early. Sometimes I would sleep on the couch or fall asleep reading, and he wouldn't even ask where I'd gone. We didn't argue. We just existed. Still married, still sharing a bed sometimes, still pretending this house was a home. When Ethan arrived, the son from David's first marriage, I assumed it would be a disruption I'd tolerate politely. Just a few weeks, I told myself. I didn't. Expect the shift in the air the moment he stepped in, tall, collected, with a suitcase in one hand and quiet awareness in the other. His politeness wasn't empty. His eyes noticed things. He didn't make small talk, but he didn't ignore me, either. There was something in the way he moved, the way he listened, that made me feel like a person again, and not just the silent fixture of someone else's life. He didn't come alone. Chloe, his fiancée, followed close behind, impossibly pretty, thin and tanned, with a tight smile and sharp eyes that never softened when she looked at me. She hated the house from the start, too quiet, too old, too country, as she put it. She walked through each room like a critic at a failed gallery show, pointing out the furniture that needed replacing and scoffing at the missing espresso machine. When she caught Ethan watching me from across the living room, her expression turned sharper, more measured, like she sensed something she couldn't name. At dinner, I made lemon chicken and grilled peaches. Chloe wrinkled her nose, muttering something about digestive issues, before pushing her plate aside. I smiled, not kindly. Ethan said nothing for a moment, then looked at her calmly and said, "Sarah's cooking could beat most places in L.A. You'd know that if you stopped trying to hate everything." His tone was quiet even, but it landed with weight. I looked up at him, startled. That wasn't just polite. That was defense, warmth, a thread of something I hadn't felt, from anyone in a long time, respect. 2 days later, Chloe packed her things after an explosive argument. I stayed upstairs, but I heard everything. Her voice was sharp, brittle, cracking through the hallway. She accused him of hiding things, of enjoying this place too much, of looking at me with something she didn't understand and didn't want to. Her final words before slamming the car door stuck like a splinter in my mind. "If you want to stay here with her, then stay. But don't you dare lie to me, Ethan." I was frozen halfway down the stairs when I heard that. I didn't mean to listen, but I did, and I didn't breathe right for the rest of that night. David left for his brother's place early the next morning, throwing a bag in the trunk and saying he'd be back in 2 days. That left me and Ethan in the house alone. I kept to myself, watering plants, wiping clean counters that didn't need cleaning, but every time I turned around, he was there. By the fridge when I reached for ice, near the garden gate when I went to hang laundry, standing by the shelf just as I reached for my book. Never too close, never touching, but always there, watching. Not in a way that scared me, in a way that made my skin feel awake for the first time in years. That afternoon, I escaped to the garden, gloves on, trowel in hand, trying to lose myself in the soft crumble of soil and the sharp scent of crushed mint. I needed the silence, the physical motion, something simple and grounding. I bent to repot one of the dying herbs, brushing sweat from my brow with the back of my arm, when I felt it again, not a sound but a change in the air behind me, like the pause before thunder. I turned and he was there, leaning against the post of the porch, arms crossed loosely, watching me in that calm, unreadable way of his. He said nothing at first, just watched. My pulse fluttered, unexpected and annoying. I went back to digging, pretending I hadn't seen him. "You like doing that?" he asked after a beat, his voice low but clear. I looked up, squinting against the sun, my hands still in the dirt. "It keeps my hands busy," I said, brushing hair from my cheek with a sigh, "and it keeps me from screaming." He tilted his head, his mouth lifting slightly, not quite a smile, but close. "You don't seem like the screaming type," he said, and I didn't answer because he wasn't wrong. I wasn't. At least not anymore. He didn't move, didn't offer to help, just stood there while I finished, and when I walked past him, to carry the potting tray inside, he didn't shift out of my way. He didn't block me either. We passed close, closer than we needed to, and I could feel the warmth radiating from his skin, could smell the faint mix of cedar and laundry detergent on his shirt. I held my breath until I was through the door, and only then exhaled. My hands shook slightly as I set the tray down. That night, I stayed up reading in the sunroom. The house had gone quiet, the kind of quiet that vibrates. David would sometimes snore down the hall or turn in his sleep, but now there was only the sound of insects outside and the soft ticking of the old wall clock. I heard Ethan's door open sometime after midnight. His footsteps moved toward the kitchen, then stopped. I froze, pretending to focus on my book, but I could feel it. His presence again, just behind the edge of the room, just beyond the threshold of what was appropriate. I waited. Nothing, no words, no movement. Then the sound of the fridge opening, a glass being filled. He moved quietly, deliberately. After a while, he passed the sunroom doorway, eyes meeting mine for only a second. No smile, no greeting. Just that same steady awareness, like he saw too much. Like he wasn't trying to look through me, he was just seeing me. I looked back at my book, but didn't read a word. The next morning, he was already in the kitchen when I came down. He was barefoot, hair damp from a shower, flipping eggs in a pan like he belonged there. He glanced over his shoulder and said, "Hope you're hungry," like this was normal, like he wasn't folding himself more and more into the cracks of my daily life. I nodded, murmured a thank you, and tried not to think about the way he moved, confident, unhurried, like a man who knew the effect of his silence. I sat at the table, watching his hands move, the curve of his wrist, the way he tilted the pan, just right. I couldn't stop imagining Chloe's last words, the accusation in them, the bitter edge of something already broken. If you want to stay with her, then stay. I wondered what she saw that night in his eyes. I wondered if it was the same thing I'd started to feel in my own breath when he looked at me too long. He set a plate in front of me, then sat across the table. For a moment, we just ate, forks tapping quietly, eyes not meeting. But beneath it all, something buzzed between us, faint but unmistakable, a new rhythm, unspoken, dangerous in its subtlety. I didn't look up until he said my name, just my name, quietly, like he was testing how it would sound alone in his mouth, and when I did meet his gaze, I couldn't look away. I stayed up later than usual, not because I had anything to do, but because sleep felt distant, like a room I wasn't allowed to enter yet, and the heat pressed against my skin like a second layer, thick and unmoving, seeping through the sheets, through the air, even through the silence that wrapped the house, in a kind of breathless stillness. I left the door to my bedroom open, just slightly, a narrow crack that let in the faint hallway glow and whatever breeze might drift past, though none ever did. I lay still for what felt like hours, legs bare, one arm draped across my stomach, the other twisted in the corner of the blanket, listening not to the clock, there wasn't one in this room, but to the soft, ceaseless hum of insects beyond the open window, to the rustle of leaves that stirred only slightly, to the complete and almost aching absence of footsteps or voices or creaking wood. My body refused to settle, every muscle stretched between rest and readiness, and my thoughts, once quiet, once controlled, drifted to places I didn't want them to go, back to the moment at breakfast when he said my name, not loudly, not meaningfully, but in a way that stayed with me long after the dishes were cleaned and put away. I tried not to think about it. I tried not to think about him. But the more I told myself to stop, the more clearly I felt his nearness, the weight of his presence when he entered a room, the way my skin reacted without permission. Eventually, I must have dozed off, though I don't remember the moment sleep took me, only that it let go with sudden violence, dragging me awake, not by a noise, not by movement, but by sensation, raw and immediate and impossible to explain. My eyes opened into a room half lit by moonlight, and I knew before I even focused that I wasn't alone. There was no sound, no breeze, no shift of floorboards, but my heart had already quickened, my skin had already tensed, and somewhere in that deep primal part of myself that never forgot how to sense danger, or something worse, I became aware of him. He stood at the edge of my bed, unmoving, a shape more than a body, his outline barely distinguishable from the shadows that stretched across the room, but I knew it was him, Ethan. I didn't ask how I knew, I didn't speak, I didn't move. My body stayed completely still, but every part of me was reaching out toward him, stretched thin across the silence. The space between us wasn't threatening, not cold, not dark in that cruel way I would have expected if it had been someone else. It was something else entirely. Something warm, low, charged, like the air before a storm breaks, like standing on a rooftop knowing no one can see you but still feeling watched. He didn't speak. He didn't come closer. He didn't have to. Every breath I took felt like it came from just inches below where he stood. The shape of him, the quiet, careful posture, the way he remained in place as if waiting for something I wasn't ready to name. It wrapped around me and held me tighter than the blanket I no longer remembered pulling over my legs. Time passed, though I couldn't tell how much. It could have been seconds or minutes or an hour, but I know I never looked away. Not really. Not even as my breath slowed and something inside me softened just enough to admit that I wasn't afraid. Then, he moved, not quickly, not with panic, but with a kind of reluctant release, like the moment had lingered too long and he knew it. He stepped back, the faintest shuffle of foot over floor, the rustle of air disturbed just slightly by motion. I heard the soft click of the door as he pulled it closed behind him, and the room fell back into its original stillness. But everything had changed. My chest rose and fell as though I'd been holding my breath for hours. My skin remained too warm, too alert, too aware of the way his nearness had shifted something internal. I didn't sleep after that. I closed my eyes, but my body stayed awake, not restless, but tuned to something sharp and intimate, something that pulsed just under the surface. And though I tried to ignore it, tried to push it away with deep breathing and cold thoughts, I knew something between us had cracked open. Nothing had happened. No words, no contact, no line crossed. But I no longer believed we were standing on opposite sides of anything. Morning came heavy, not with sleep, but with the residue of whatever had happened in the dark, the kind of weight that settles not on your body but somewhere deeper, like a presence you carry without knowing where it touches. I didn't rush to get dressed. I lingered by the mirror longer than necessary, pulling my hair back only to let it fall again, choosing a soft tee and linen shorts not because they flattered me, but because I didn't want to pretend. The heat was already clinging to the air when I stepped into the kitchen, but what hit me first wasn't the temperature. It was the scent of fresh coffee and the sound of a spoon clicking gently against ceramic. He was there before me, already, moving through the space like he belonged, barefoot, focused, his back to me as he poured the second mug without asking if I wanted one, as if he knew. I watched him for a second longer than I meant to, the strength in his shoulders, the curve of his spine as he leaned forward slightly, the ease in the way he breathed. He turned as I stepped farther in, placed the mug on the table without comment, and only then did his eyes meet mine, brief but certain, not avoiding, not chasing, just present. I murmured a thank you and took the first sip too quickly, letting the heat bloom across my tongue just to feel something direct, something immediate that could compete with the undercurrent humming through the room. We didn't speak. Not because there was nothing to say, but because everything that could have been spoken already hung between us, thick and quiet and understood. His fingers drummed once against the counter, and then he leaned back, folding his arms. His gaze flicked toward the hallway behind me, toward the space we'd both shared only in shadow. I didn't ask. I didn't need to. We both remembered. The silence between us wasn't awkward. It was deliberate. It was what people use when they don't want to lie but can't tell the truth either. I stirred my coffee, though it didn't need stirring, and kept my eyes low because I wasn't ready to look at him again. Not yet. Not with that image of him standing by my bed still etched in the soft places of my mind. After breakfast, I moved through the house like I was underwater, aware of where he was without needing to see him, the way a compass knows where north is even when buried. I cleaned what didn't need cleaning, checked my phone though no one was texting me, opened windows to let in air that carried no relief. Eventually I slipped out to the porch, barefoot, arms crossed over my chest like armor, and let the heat wrap around me, hoping it would burn away whatever trace of that night still clung to my skin. I didn't hear him approach until he was already beside me, his presence quiet but unmistakable, the kind of stillness that changes the shape of the air around it. He didn't stand too close, but he didn't keep distance either. His voice came low, even, calm like always. "I didn't mean to scare you," he said, not as an excuse, but as a truth. I turned my head, meeting his eyes fully now, and let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. "You didn't scare me," I said, and it was true. That wasn't fear I'd felt. It had been something slower, something heavier, something with its own heat. I looked back out over the porch, toward the trees that barely moved. "But now we both know," I added, the words quiet, not accusing, not questioning, just naming what had shifted. He didn't reply right away. He didn't need to. The pause said enough. I felt him shift slightly beside me, the soft scrape of his heel against the wood, and I knew he understood. We had stepped into something, maybe without meaning to, maybe without wanting to, but the step had been taken, and no amount of silence could undo that. Later, after he'd gone back inside and the porch was mine again, I stayed seated for a long time, listening to the cicadas, to the wind that never arrived, to the rhythm of my own breath as it tried to slow. I wasn't ready to admit what I wanted, but I couldn't unfeel what had already started. The next morning brought no relief, only a heavier stillness that settled between the walls like something waiting to be acknowledged. And although I moved through the kitchen and the hallway and the soft corners of this too-quiet house with a practiced calm, inside I felt unraveled, exposed, peeled open by something I couldn't name, but that had everything to do with the way Ethan looked at me now. It wasn't overt, it wasn't inappropriate by definition, but it was constant, steady, a gaze that didn't glance or flicker or shy away but landed and stayed, as though his eyes weren't just seeing me, they were searching, mapping something, invisible under the surface. And every time I caught it, my body reacted before my thoughts could intervene. I stirred my coffee with deliberate focus, eyes fixed on the swirl inside the mug, pretending I didn't feel the heat of his presence. Behind me, pretending my spine wasn't stiff with attention, pretending I wasn't trembling in places no one could see. I asked about the weather, made small jokes about the overripe bananas on the counter, commented on a squirrel I'd seen tearing apart the bird feeder, and through it all, I kept my voice light, casual, maybe even warm, but inside I was brittle with tension, because I knew he remembered standing at my bed just as clearly as I remembered opening my eyes to find him there, and now the silence between us was not innocent. All day I felt him near, not always physically, but emotionally, as if our breaths had synced without permission, and even when we weren't in the same room, I knew which floorboard would creak next, which door he would open, which rhythm of movement belonged to him alone. I hated how aware I had become of his body, of the way his shirt clung to the lines of his shoulders when he leaned over the sink, of how the veins in his forearms shifted when he carried something heavy, of the sound of his voice when he called the dog in a tone I wished he would use on me. I hated it because I couldn't turn it off, and because I had no one to confess it to, not even myself. That evening, I went upstairs to grab the book I hadn't touched in 2 days, and as I turned the corner of the narrow hallway, I nearly collided with him, his chest only inches from mine, his hand lifting instinctively to steady me at the elbow though I hadn't stumbled, though I hadn't moved at all, and we both paused, frozen in that tight space, the air between us suddenly, so charged it made my skin hum. His voice came low, almost thoughtful, as he tilted his head slightly, not smiling, but not serious either, just aware, fully present. "You look different," he said, and I felt his eyes trace not my body, but the energy around me. Lighter, like you've let something go. I didn't answer right away because I wasn't sure I could, not without giving something away, so I just let out a small exhale and offered him the softest smile I could manage, not because I felt at ease, but because anything else would have broken me. I started to step aside, but he didn't move. Instead, he looked at me with that same depth that made me feel like he was speaking to something behind my ribcage, and his next words came steady, certain, as if he'd been waiting to say them for far too long. "You're not my stepmother," he said, voice even but deep, like a string pulled taut, "and I've never been your son. We both know that." I swallowed hard and turned my face slightly away, not to hide but to slow down whatever was unraveling between us, because it was too much, too fast, and I needed a second to remember who I was. "You're playing with fire," I said, and I meant it, not as a warning but as a truth, quiet and sharp. He didn't flinch, didn't soften. "Then tell me to stop," he said, still close, his voice a breath lower. But I didn't. I couldn't. The words didn't come, and in the silence that followed, his hand moved, not quickly, not with force, just gently, calmly, as he brought his fingers to the side of my face, his thumb brushing along the curve of my cheek with a restraint that made my entire body still. I should have stepped back. I should have said something. But I didn't, because the heat of that touch wasn't wrong. It was real, and my body recognized it before my mind allowed it. His lips found mine like a question barely asked, soft and searching, nothing hurried or claimed, just the tremble of a line being crossed slowly, deliberately, as if he needed to know how far I would let him go. And for one suspended moment, I let him. The kiss didn't deepen quickly, didn't demand more than it offered, and yet I felt it everywhere, not just on my lips, but in the sudden stillness of my breath, in the sharp curve of my spine as I resisted, the instinct to move closer, in the way my heart knocked unevenly against my ribs like it hadn't decided whether to run or to stay. His mouth was warm and unsure in the way that only something honest can be, and for a moment that stretched longer than it should have, I let it happen, not because I was swept away, but because I needed to feel it, to know what it meant when someone touched me without obligation, without habit, without the heavy silence of a dying marriage pressed between us. His hand never left my face and his body didn't press into mine, and that restraint, his quiet, deliberate stillness, told me more than words ever could about how deeply he was aware of what this was, how conscious he was of the weight it carried. And still, I didn't pull away. I didn't break the moment. I stood there and allowed his lips to linger on mine, light and hesitant and so impossibly human that I felt something inside me loosen, like a knot I'd been holding for years had quietly come undone in the dark. But I had to be the one to end it, because I was older, because I was married, because I still believed in lines even when they were already blurred. So I brought my hand to his chest, not to push him but to pause him and whispered, "We can't." My voice was steady but low, each word chosen like a pebble set down gently to mark a path back to where we came from. He didn't argue. He didn't flinch. He stepped back, a breath, a shift, and when he met my eyes again, there was no confusion. In his face, only a kind of quiet disappointment that was both respectful and unmistakably real. He nodded once, just enough to acknowledge what I'd said, but in his gaze there was no regret for having kissed me, no shame for having wanted to. What I saw instead was something heavier, something that told me he hadn't acted on impulse, that he had thought about this, long before this hallway, long before last night, and that it was only my resistance, not uncertainty, that had made him stop. And in that moment, I knew that if I hadn't said anything, he would not have stopped. He would have let the world fall away, would have stepped closer, would have kissed me again and again until I forgot where we were. He left before I did, his steps careful, slow, unhurried, like someone leaving a room that still held warmth, but choosing to close the door anyway. I remained where I was, hand still hovering in the air where his chest had been, lips tingling with the memory of his, my breath shallow and uneven, my mind already trying to rewrite the moment into something smaller than it was, but I couldn't. I knew better. That kiss wasn't small. It was quiet. Yes, but not small. It lived now inside me, in a space I hadn't opened for years. Later that night, I lay in bed with the lights off, the fan clicking slowly above, sheets pushed down around my legs because the heat hadn't let up, not outside and not in me either. I turned once, twice, trying to find a position that didn't feel like his arms, trying to bury my face into the pillow in a way that didn't remind me of how his hand had touched my cheek. My body wasn't restless. It was alert. My skin felt as though it remembered too much. Eventually, I lay on my back, staring at the ceiling through the slats of moonlight that broke through the window, and I lifted my fingers to my lips. Not dramatically, not even consciously at first, just a light touch, a reflex like checking for a wound that didn't bleed. And when I felt that trace of him still there, warm and impossibly tender, I closed my eyes and let my palm rest over my mouth. I didn't cry. I didn't smile. I just stayed there, hand against my lips, breath steady, heart quiet but full, knowing that nothing had truly happened. But everything had already changed. The air in the house had turned thick and restless, the kind of heat that didn't just sit on your skin but crawled underneath it, settling in your chest and between your shoulder blades, making every movement feel slower, every breath heavier, and yet somehow I felt lighter that morning, like my body had finally stopped resisting something it was never meant to fight. Ethan had already opened all the windows, but the stillness outside offered no breeze, only light that poured in through the kitchen blinds in long golden strips, cutting across the counters and making even the fruit in the bowl look like it was holding its breath. We moved together in silence at first, slicing peaches and strawberries, rinsing blueberries, setting bowls in rows like we were preparing for some invisible gathering neither of us had spoken aloud. His presence was no longer a question I was trying to avoid, but a fact I was learning to live with. And as we moved around each other, reaching for the same towel, brushing past near the sink, sharing the rhythm of a task too simple to distract us, I found myself laughing at something he said about the tomatoes being dramatic, splitting open just because they were hot, and the sound that came out of me felt unfamiliar, bright, full, like something that had been buried for years and was only now remembering how to rise. He handed me the glass bowl of rinsed mint leaves, and when his fingers touched my elbow, softly, without hesitation but without pressure, I didn't flinch, I didn't pretend not to notice, I didn't step back. Instead, I let my hand stay where it was for a beat too long, and when I looked up, his eyes were already waiting for mine, not asking, not guessing, just holding. We stayed like that for several seconds, the bowl suspended between us, his hand still resting lightly against my arm, and in that pause something shifted again, not new but more certain. "I don't want to pretend this is a game," he said, his voice low and steady, the kind of voice you can't run from because it doesn't chase you, it just waits. "I want to be honest about what this is." I didn't drop my gaze, not this time, not anymore, because I was tired of acting like I hadn't been replaying that hallway kiss in my mind every night since it happened, tired of telling myself that if I didn't speak it out loud, it wouldn't be real. "We've both been pretending this is just an accident, something harmless," I said, my voice clearer than I expected, the heat making my skin feel raw and real. "But I think about you every night. I think about what it meant when you kissed me. I think about how it didn't feel like a mistake. He stepped closer, not fast, not forceful, just a shift in gravity that pulled the air between us tighter. And when his hand reached up to touch my jaw, I didn't hesitate, didn't resist, didn't do anything except lean into it just enough to tell him he was allowed. Our mouths met again, and this time there was nothing tentative or unsure about it. The kiss was full, deep, warm, like the truth we had both been dancing around had finally decided to speak for itself. His fingers traced my spine as he pulled me closer, and when my hand slid around his waist, I felt the way his body molded to mine with the kind of ease that only comes when something already belongs. There was no urgency, no frantic need to tear anything away, only the slow burn of recognition. The way his lips moved against mine like he had memorized the shape of me in some other life. The way I tilted my chin and pressed in like I had been waiting for this since the moment he first stepped into our kitchen. His hand moved to my shoulder, then slowly down my arm, his touch both grounding and electric. And as the heat built between us, not from the air but from the way our breath had begun to sink, I whispered against his mouth, "Not here." He paused, nodded once without speaking, and gently took my hand, leading me out of the kitchen, down the hallway, into the guest room that had once belonged to no one, and now felt like it had been waiting for this exact moment to happen. The bed was unmade from yesterday's linen change, the window half open, a fan spinning slowly in the corner like it was trying not to interrupt. We lay down side by side, not tangled, not rushing, just close, our legs brushing, our foreheads touching as we kissed again and again, slower this time, deeper, our hands exploring in deliberate lines, not desperate to get somewhere, but determined, to feel everything on the way. His body was warm beside mine, not overwhelming but steady, a kind of silent anchor in the heat-heavy room, and as we lay there face to face with only inches of air between us, the weight of our restraint felt more intimate than anything reckless could have been, because every kiss was intentional, every touch carefully measured, every breath matched with the unspoken understanding that something had already shifted beyond return. My fingertips traced slow paths across the inside of his wrist, feeling the pulse that beat there, steady and strong, and when his hand found my waist and held it with the gentlest pressure, I let out a breath I didn't know I had been holding, because in that moment, I wasn't Sarah the wife, or Sarah the woman who spent too many nights alone. I was just the version of myself I had forgotten how to feel. He leaned in close, our foreheads nearly touching, and I could feel his breath slow as mine did, each one drawing something softer, from inside me, something that had been buried under years of silence and closed doors and polite dinners. I shifted closer, my leg brushing against his, and when his arm slid fully around my back and pulled me gently into his chest, I didn't resist. I curved into him like I was meant to be there, like I had been reaching toward this shape in the dark for longer than I could admit. His breath tickled the side of my neck, and when he whispered my name, not as a question but as a confirmation, I felt it land low in my stomach, stirring a wave of heat that had nothing to do with the summer. When his hand moved to my shoulder, fingertips brushing the strap of my dress, I felt the question there before he asked it, and I answered with a look, not a nod, not a word, just a look that said not now, not here, but soon. His lips found mine again, slower now, as if savoring the rhythm of what we weren't yet ready to complete, and I kissed him back with all the certainty I had been denying myself since the day he walked through our door. We didn't speak. We didn't need to. Our bodies were already saying more than our mouths ever could. I let my fingers rest on his arm, grounding myself in the quiet presence of someone who felt known, the proof that this wasn't a dream or a memory or a cruel joke life had played on me. He shivered slightly at my touch but didn't move, only breathed deeper, his arm tightening around me like he needed me to stay exactly where I was. We lay like that, close and quiet, lips brushing, fingers exploring, our breath rising and falling in the same rhythm, the space between us dissolving with every shift. And then his phone rang. The sound shattered the moment like glass, sharp and immediate, vibrating against the wooden nightstand with an insistence that didn't belong in the room we had made. I froze. So did he. He turned just enough to glance at the screen, and I followed his gaze, already knowing before I saw it. Her name lit the screen in sharp white letters, Chloe. His breath caught, not loud, but I felt it. He didn't reach for it. He didn't silence it. He just stared, as if the phone ringing was a tether to something he had almost let go of. My body remained pressed against his, but my mind moved faster than my heart, and I reached for the phone before he did. I didn't ask for permission. I didn't look for a signal in his face. I just picked it up, saw her name once more, and without a word, I declined the call. The silence that followed wasn't awkward, it was decisive. He looked at me, not in shock, not in anger, but in something like disbelief, as if I had just drawn a line neither of us had dared admit existed. I held his gaze and let the moment stretch, not backing down, not apologizing, not explaining, because I didn't have to. Everything was already clear. I set the phone down gently, screen down, and turned my body back to face him, my fingers brushing once across his cheek. "You already made your choice," I said, my voice low but unwavering, every word shaped by the clarity that had finally settled in my chest. "And I just made mine." He didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes told me everything I needed to know. We weren't pretending anymore. He came back without warning, the crunch of tires on gravel cutting through the quiet morning like a knife, and before I could smooth my shirt or gather my thoughts, David was already on the porch, arms full of grocery bags, calling out a cheerful, "Honey, I'm home," like nothing in this house had changed while he was gone, like the foundation beneath us wasn't cracked wide open from the inside. I stood frozen in the kitchen doorway, sunlight behind me, the smell of coffee lingering in the air, and when Ethan came in from the garden, wiping his hands on his shirt, I saw him falter for a single breath before composing his face into something neutral, something distant, something safe. David swept into the kitchen with the noise and energy of someone who had no idea the silence he was stepping into was poisoned, pulling cheeses and herbs and pastries from the bags like he had just come back from Paris and not his brother's lake house. And I forced myself to smile, to nod, to answer his small talk with matching sounds that didn't belong to me anymore. I felt Ethan's presence like a weight across the room, not looking at me, not moving toward me, not daring to do either, and we played our parts like actors trapped in the wrong scene, waiting for the director to yell cut. He insisted we all eat together, made a plate for each of us, buttered toast, poured juice, gestured for us to sit as if this was a celebration and not a funeral, and I sat across from the two of them with my knees pressed together and my fingers clenched around. A fork I never lifted. I couldn't look at Ethan, not because I didn't want to, but because I was afraid that if I did, I wouldn't be able to look away. And David was right there, still smiling, still humming, still living in a version of our life that no longer existed. My throat ached from pretending. My stomach churned. The juice tasted like pulp and lies. Ethan barely spoke, nodding occasionally, answering with one-word replies, his posture straight but closed, his shoulders tense like a violin string pulled, too tight, and though he never looked directly at me, I knew he felt it too, that unnatural weight pressing down on both of us, the ghost of what had happened 2 nights ago still breathing between us like it had its own body, its own heartbeat. I watched David butter another croissant and ask Ethan if he wanted to join him on a fishing trip next weekend, and I felt something splinter in my chest when Ethan said maybe, because that word had nothing to do with fishing. After breakfast, I cleaned the plates with mechanical precision, scrubbing dishes that were already clean, stacking them with care just to keep my hands moving, because if they stopped, I didn't know what they might reach for. David disappeared upstairs with a mug of coffee and a newspaper under his arm, muttering something about catching up on sleep, and when I heard the door to the bedroom click shut, I stood there in the middle of the kitchen, heart thudding, listening to the house go still. Ethan leaned against the hallway wall, not speaking, not moving, just watching me, and for a moment neither of us breathed. I didn't say it, but I was waiting for nightfall. When it finally came, I moved through the house in silence, every light dimmed, every step measured, pretending I was tired, pretending I was busy, pretending I didn't hear the soft creak of Ethan's bedroom door opening after David began to snore upstairs. I went to my room without locking the door, not out of forgetfulness, not out of carelessness, but because something in me refused to pretend anymore. I lay down, fully dressed, the sheet pulled over me only halfway, my body already bracing for what might happen, and the moment I heard him approach, slow and deliberate, my heart rose into my throat and stayed there, pulsing, breathless, expectant. He didn't knock. He didn't speak. He stepped into the room like he belonged there, bare feet quiet on the floor, his outline shaped by the low hallway light behind him, and when I turned toward him, there was no hesitation. He came to me, with a kind of gravity neither of us could resist, and when he bent over me and kissed me, it wasn't gentle, or cautious, or uncertain. It was hungry, held back too long, the kind of kiss that starts deep in the chest and burns its way to the mouth, and I met it with equal force, my fingers reaching for him without thought, pulling him closer, holding him there like he was the only thing keeping me from falling apart. His hands framed my face as he kissed me, and when he pulled back to look at me, our foreheads touching, our breaths shared, I didn't ask if this was a mistake because I already knew it was and didn't care. He slid onto the bed beside me, his arm wrapping around my back, our legs tangling as if this had always been their natural position, and in the dark, with only our breath between us, we let go of every reason we shouldn't have done this, and held on to the only truth that still mattered. We had already crossed the line, and we weren't coming back. His body pressed against mine with a kind of aching familiarity, not rushed, but urgent in the way that only silence can be when it stretches too far. And as we lay there tangled in shadows and breath, he kissed me again, this time without hesitation, like he already knew what I wouldn't say out loud, like he had made peace with every consequence that would follow. My hands moved across his chest, feeling the solid heat of him beneath my fingers, the slow rhythm of his breathing as it synced with mine, and I let myself melt into it, not out of weakness, but because I couldn't pretend anymore that I didn't need to feel this, didn't need to be seen, didn't need to be wanted in a way that was impossible to ignore. He reached for my hand, holding it between both of his like something fragile he couldn't put down, and I let out a soft, broken sound that wasn't quite a gasp, wasn't quite a plea, but something between them, something I had forgotten how to release. I shifted closer instinctively, afraid the stillness between us might fracture if I moved too far away. And when his hand moved down my arm and rested against my hip, firm but reverent, I pressed into him instinctively, surrendering to the heat, blooming between us, the inevitability of it, the reckless, deliberate unraveling. The room around us had faded completely. The windows, the soft hum of the ceiling fan, the house beyond the door, all of it felt distant, unreal, like a world that didn't belong to us anymore. And for those few minutes, it was just him and me, two people who no longer cared about the rules they had broken, or the ring I still wore, or the name that still tied me to a man sleeping just a few feet away. Ethan whispered something I didn't catch, and it didn't matter, because it wasn't the words that moved me. It was the way he said them, like they were meant only for the space between his lips and my skin. His hand moved slowly to my shoulder, steady and careful, as if making sure I wouldn't step away, and I closed my eyes, arching slightly beneath his touch, not out of seduction, but out of need, deep and slow and dangerous. I reached for him, touched his face, his chest, the curve of his shoulder, memorizing each detail with reverent fingers, and when our foreheads touched again and we both breathed in at the same time, I knew we had gone too far to stop. He leaned into me, not forcefully but fully, and the nearness between us took up all the space in the room, like nothing else existed for that moment, the only thing I wanted to, and then the door slammed open. The sound wasn't loud by itself, but it cracked through the silence like a shot, and in that one instant, everything around us changed. We both froze. My eyes flew open. Ethan's hand went still on my waist. I didn't have time to move. I didn't have time to think. The light from the hallway poured into the room, catching the edges of our bare arms, our locked limbs, our shared breath, and standing in the doorway, framed by the uneven glow of the upstairs landing, was David. He didn't speak at first. He didn't have to. The expression on his face said everything: shock, betrayal, confusion, rage, flashing one after another in an ugly, raw procession. His mouth opened once, then closed again. His hands curled into fists at his sides, and for a heartbeat I thought he might collapse under the weight of what he was seeing. But then he found his voice, and it came out broken and sharp, slicing the air between us. "What the hell are you doing?" he shouted, and the words felt like they landed on my skin with real force, yanking me upright as Ethan instinctively pulled away, sitting up fast, hands raised slightly like he was trying to explain something even he didn't believe. "David?" he started. But the rest never came because David crossed the room in 3 fast, violent steps and shoved him hard in the chest, not enough to knock him down, but enough to send a clear message. "Don't speak, don't move, don't think you'll talk. Your way out of this. Don't," David hissed, voice thick with rage, his eyes flashing as he turned to me, his gaze so full of disbelief I couldn't bear to meet it. "Are you out of your goddamn mind?" I stood, wrapping the sheet around myself like armor, heart pounding in my throat, and I stepped between them without planning to, without thinking, only knowing that if I didn't, this room would break open into something worse than anything that had already happened. Ethan's jaw was tight, his shoulders braced, but he didn't speak again. He didn't try to defend me. He just looked at David, then at me, and waited. "Stop," I said, voice low but sharp, my palm against David's chest, not to push, but to hold. "Just stop." For a moment, no one moved. No one breathed. The only sound was the thick pulse in my ears, the echo of that slammed door, the tension so dense it felt like it had form. Then David stepped back, his hands still shaking, his eyes narrowing as he looked at us one last time. And I knew, in that terrible stillness, that everything had come apart. Morning came without apology, the pale light spilling across the floor like nothing had happened, like walls hadn't cracked and hearts hadn't broken inside them. And yet I stood barefoot in the hall, arms folded, tightly across my chest, watching David walk down the stairs with a calmness that didn't belong to this day, didn't belong to any morning where a marriage had just shattered in silence and shouting. His suitcase was already by the door, upright and zipped with precision, the kind of detail that showed how long he had been packing in his mind, how far back the decision had already been made. And when he passed me without pausing, without speaking, without even glancing to see if I would stop him, I didn't move, didn't speak, didn't beg. The door opened, the door closed. He didn't look back. I stayed where I was for a long time, not because I didn't know what to do, but because I had no idea how to move through a house that no longer held the shape of what it was meant to protect. No idea how to breathe in. A room that still carried his aftershave and his silence. No idea how to stand upright when everything in me wanted to collapse. I pressed my palms against my chest like I could hold my ribs together, like I could contain whatever was breaking open inside me. But the only thing I felt was stillness, not peace, not grief. Just the hollow ache of absence beginning to settle. Later that day, Ethan stood in the doorway to the guest room, a small duffel bag over his shoulder, his eyes tired in a way that didn't come from sleep deprivation but from something heavier, something final. And when he spoke, his voice was quiet even, as if anything louder would unravel whatever thread of strength we were both still holding on to. "I can't stay," he said. And I looked up slowly, already knowing the rest of the sentence before he said it. "It's not right. I didn't ask him to. I didn't plead or reach for his hand or give him a speech about love conquering consequences because I knew he was right, and I also knew something else just as clearly, that what we had shared, however short, however broken, had been real." "I know," I said, my voice steady in the way grief sometimes makes things steady, too flat for panic, too tired for argument. But it was true. He didn't answer, and I didn't expect him to. He stepped forward, bent down, kissed my forehead with a kind of reverence that made my knees weaken. And then he turned, his footsteps quiet, his presence shrinking with every step until the door clicked shut behind him like punctuation on a chapter I hadn't wanted to finish reading. And just like that, I was alone. The house felt larger than it had ever been, every room an echo chamber of memory, every object suddenly louder in its stillness, the ticking of the clock in the living room, the hum of the refrigerator, the soft creak of the stairs when no one climbed them anymore. No one called, no one texted. The silence wasn't peaceful. It was punishment. I passed people in town who used to wave but now looked away too quickly or stared too long. I could feel the weight of their thoughts clinging to my shoulders like a second skin, and yet none of it surprised me. Not the judgment, not the isolation, not the way even familiar streets felt colder now. A week later, I received an envelope with no return address, the handwriting unmistakably hers, and before I opened it, I already knew who it was from. Chloe's words were few, written in a looping, precise script that somehow still carried her voice. "You got him. There's nothing left here for me." There was no accusation, no insult, just a simple truth and a sharp edge that dug deeper than I expected. I tore the letter in half, then in half again, the pieces scattering across the table like ash, but the ache in my chest didn't fade. It only curled tighter, days blurred, weeks thinned. I moved through the house like a visitor, cooking for one with movements that grew smaller each evening, pouring 1 cup of coffee instead of 2, folding, laundry that no longer came in pairs. I learned not to cry, not because the tears didn't come, but because I had grown used to holding them in, had taught myself that letting them fall didn't change the shape of an empty bed or silence the sounds that never came back. I began measuring time in the way shadows moved across the floors, in the way the light shifted on the walls, in the way the echo of a closing cabinet took longer to disappear. And then the postcard came. It arrived on a Tuesday, the kind of day that carried no weight, no significance, just another morning wrapped in silence, another breakfast eaten without taste, another hour measured by the slow movement of shadows across the floor. And when I opened the mailbox and saw it lying there among flyers and bills, I didn't react right away, didn't gasp or smile or even freeze. I just stood in the doorway with the postcard in my hand, turning it over once, twice, as if the weight of it could somehow prepare me for what it might say. The paper was thick, slightly textured, worn at the corners like it had been held tightly, maybe even reconsidered more than once before being sent, and the front showed a picture of a lake. Not ours, not anywhere I recognized, but it didn't matter, because the only thing that mattered was the handwriting on the back. I knew it was his before I read the first word. There was no greeting, no Sarah, no date, no closing, just one sentence written in black ink, the letters slanted, forward, familiar in their imperfect lines. "If you still believe in this, meet me at the place where it began." That was all. No time, no signature, no explanation, and yet it was the clearest message I had received in weeks, louder than any apology could have been, more certain than any plan we could have made. And when I read it again, slower this time, I felt something shift inside me, not a rush, not joy, not even relief, but something quieter, something solid, something like recognition. I sat down at the edge of the table, the postcard resting between my palms, my thumbs brushing the corners like I could feel his presence there, and for the first time in days, I let myself close my eyes and ask the only question that mattered. Did I still believe in it? I thought about the sound of his voice in the hallway, the weight of his hand on my waist, the way my name had sounded when he said it in the dark, low and full and certain, like it was something sacred. I thought about the pain, the mess, the fallout. I thought about the heat in the garden, the kiss that changed everything, the phone screen glowing with her name, the choice I made when I reached for it anyway, and I knew my answer. I stood up slowly, the motion deliberate, my legs steady, beneath me in a way they hadn't been in weeks, and I walked down the hallway that had once held our secret, past the guest room door that now stood ajar, its emptiness no longer sharp but quiet, a stillness I had made peace with. In the bedroom, the air smelled faintly of lavender and linen, clean and empty, and I opened the closet with calm hands, not rushed, not shaking, just sure. I reached for the small overnight bag on the top shelf, the one I hadn't used since before everything began, and laid it gently on the bed. I folded clothes with purpose, not for show, not with hope blooming wild in my chest, but with a quiet readiness, with the kind of clarity that comes after you've lost everything and still find yourself standing, breathing, wanting. I packed light, just enough to walk away from this place without turning it into an escape, just enough to arrive without asking for promises. I slipped the postcard into the side pocket of the bag, where I could feel its weight without needing to see it, and zipped it closed with a motion that felt like a decision sealing itself in place. Before I left, I walked through the house one last time, touching the back of the couch with my fingertips, brushing the frame of the kitchen doorway where I had once leaned while he sliced peaches and smiled without smiling, pausing at the bottom of the staircase where David had once stood and shouted, and where everything we built had shattered under. The truth we could no longer hide. I didn't cry, I didn't break. I only stood still for a moment, long enough to let the silence mark the end of something. Outside, the air had cooled slightly, the sky beginning to dim at the edges, the breeze gentle but certain, and as I walked down the path, bag over my shoulder, I felt the earth shift beneath my feet, not like a warning, but like permission. I didn't know what I would find when I got there. I didn't know if he'd still be waiting or if this had only been a moment of weakness in the form of ink and paper. But I knew I would go because some choices aren't about what's safe or what's right. They're about what's already alive inside you, no matter how quiet it's been. I stepped off the porch, took a breath, and kept walking toward whatever would meet me at the place where it began.